Alright, so here's my final project for STM 260. And it's basically a system that keeps track of whose turn it is in like a board game or any other type of game you're feeling like. And so it's got two buttons, this button here and the button on the board. This button allows us to basically choose how many players are going to be in the game. So if you go up to 8, we can then select that with the button on the board, and it'll go into the other main loop of the game and display whose turn it is, as well as start a timer to keep track of how long a player has spent on their turn. If they spend too long, then the LED turns on, and after about 5 seconds or so, it'll turn off and skip to the next person. And so you can now see this player 2. And so we can then go to the next player's turn by pressing the buttons, and we can go all the way up to 8. And then we'll wrap around, and button 1 will reset, go back to the setup mode.
So here we have the main code of my program, or my project. And so there's two modes for it. The setup mode, which takes care of displaying the number of players that we want to choose at the beginning. And then outside of that mode, we have the display of whose turn it is on the screen. So we get it to scroll down the screen using these three main functions that you see here. So each of the banks on the GLCD store a values for what we're going to display. And so this prepare bank takes all of those values and stores them in a separate temporary variable that we can edit before loading it back in. And this just preserves data so that we don't lose anything in the process of changing it. And so the first one takes it, loads it all in, including the most significant byte from the previous bank, which in this case would be screen 5, and keeps it in that temporary variable until we load it back in down here. But before we load it back in, we want to grab the most significant row of bytes from screen 0 so that we can load them into the next screen, so we get the appearance of it shifting down 1 bit at a time on the screen. So we do that with every single one of the banks, and then after we have loaded everything properly, we then display everything. And there's a small delay after each time so that we can actually see what it's displaying. Moving downward, we can see what the interrupts do in the project. So I have two buttons. There's a button on the board, which is this button 2. And so what it takes care of is setting the mode of the game. So it'll either be in setup mode or not. And if the board is already in setup mode, then it's going to prepare the GLCD screen so that we can actually display whose turn it is and how many players there are, as well as start the timer to keep track of how long people are spending on their turns. And so it does that, and if it's not in setup mode, then it's going to put the number of players back down to the minimum, stop the timer so that we don't have any interrupts during that time from the timer, and it also preloads the banks so that we can display the messages of selecting the number of players properly on the screen. And then it just toggles back and forth each time you press the button. Second button is the one that actually chooses how many players there are. So in setup mode, it chooses the number of players. Every time it's pressed, it just increments it by 1, and then if it goes over the maximum number of players allowed, then it just rolls back to the minimum. Otherwise, if it's outside of setup mode, each time it's pressed, then it should go to the next player's turn. So that's what it does. Adds 1 to the player turn, and it rolls back over, back to 1, once it reaches the maximum number of players it's currently playing. And it also loads the message of whose turn it is and puts that message on the screen. Then we have a timer that keeps track of how long people are spending on their turns. And so if they have spent the 15 seconds in this case, each time the timer goes off, it goes off every second. It'll increase this elapsed time. Once that gets to 15 or more, then it turns on the LED. And once it gets to the maximum time, then in that case, it turns off the LED and skips that player's turn, moving on to the next player in the sequence. And that's pretty much the main part of the code. I hope you guys like the project. I thought it was cool and fun to work on. All right, thank you.